Welcome to a book forum at the Cato Institute. Our book today is The Unraveling, Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis by our guest author, Bob Bauer. Welcome, Bob. You've been to Cato before, and it's always been a delight to have you here. And it's especially delightful to have you come and talk about your new book. Now, for those of you who don't know Robert F. Bauer, I'll give you a basic idea. He is now professor of practice at New York University School of Law, co-director of NYU Law's Legislative and Regulatory Process Clinic. He's former White House counsel to President Barack Obama in 2009-2011, former general counsel to the Democratic National Committee. It's not here in the official, but he's also been a close advisor to our current president, President Joseph Biden. And I think the way to sort of summarize it is Bob is no doubt the most important and influential election lawyer for the Democratic Party in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So a person with a real insight into politics, both in practice, but I've also found Bob over time to be a person who is thoughtful about politics, reads widely, and so I was very excited to have him come here at Cato and talk about his new book. So let's start, and we always have great conversations, so I'm looking forward to this. Let's start with the title, Bob. Mm-hmm. What is it unraveled and why? What does ethics have to do with it and democracy?
We could situate the conversation about ethics within this larger theme we've heard a lot about in recent years about norms, which is we have a process, a formal process for how the government works, how leaders are selected. We have laws that govern that process in certain material respects. And then we have norms which are not legal requirements for making that process work or having the public have confidence in that process. They are ways of behavior, customs, habits, responsibilities that people accept that are not legal in nature. And the way I like to look at it is ethical choices are individual choices that are made to effectuate those norms. So, for example, we have a norm made famous in a book that the political scientists Ziblatt and Levitsky wrote. We have a norm of mutual tolerance, that we accept that we have adversaries, opponents, people who disagree with us in the political space, but we tolerate them in certain respects. We accept, for example, that they win elections, and we recognize that if they win this one, then we still have an opportunity to compete in the next one. That's a norm, very abstract. How that norm is implemented, how it's effectuated, depends on particular choices that people with public or political responsibilities make at particular times. And so the book is focused on what happens when people in public and political responsibility begin to lose sight of the ethical dimension of the choices that they make, particularly with reference to what they need to do to preserve, to honor, to respect, to strengthen democratic processes and expectations.
And so the book really points us toward examples in your own life where you thought norms and ethics made a difference or should have made a difference. I mean, one of the things about the book is, there's an old statement about politicians that seemed to me very true in the experience I had with them, which was never apologize and never explain. But your book doesn't exactly apologize, but you acknowledge that if you had it to do over in several cases, you probably might well have taken a different decision. And in fact, the book explains a lot about how to be a lawyer and the pressures on a lawyer in a high government position. So in a sense, either the laws of politics have changed or you have gotten in your post-election law era, you've sort of disregarding the law of the politician, never apologize, never explain, or at least, again, you don't apologize, but you sort of, it's a very reflective memoir work, and what struck me about it was most memoirs are really, they're there to justify what I did, and yours isn't. You have some doubts.
No, in order for us to get some handle on the polarized politics of the moment, and to think about what is real and what is less real in the pressures on the democratic process in the United States. A bipartisan dialogue, a nonpartisan dialogue is necessary, and anyone who participates in that, I think, has to approach it with some degree of humility and put their own choices on the table for conversation. Now, I was constrained in what I could discuss in the book by the operation of the attorney-client privilege and by the need to observe client confidentiality. But in many respects, some of what I defended publicly, and some of what I did as a lawyer was attributed to me professionally. And I own the part where, looking back, what might have thrilled me at the time as a marvelous exercise of legal ingenuity strikes me as probably not well considered. And I think in order for this conversation to be a real and honest conversation, you have to start by saying, okay, I'm willing to enter into this conversation with some degree of self-reflectiveness. I don't apologize or regret everything in the book. It's not a full-fledged apologia, but it's an attempt to take into account, by using not only other examples, but examples from my own career, of where, for example, runaway partisanship can cause you to overlook meaningful ethical considerations that relate to the preservation of the democratic process and norms.
So, I mean, that is one of the many, there's several striking parts about this book, but the a person like you that became an election lawyer and rose to the top of your profession, that's really a highly partisan position by its nature. Yes. There is a sense in which you're supposed to be a partisan. That's part of the system. So the strange, how is it that you think, on the one hand, you lived that and you succeeded in that, but what you see in this book is a real concern, and I know from our past experiences together, you're really open to, you don't demonize the other side, unless they deserve it, of course, but generally speaking, you're open to working. You talk about people you work with from Republican side, and you also, I know you and Ben Ginsberg had a long and amusing and very fruitful experience together. Can you talk about, I mean, wasn't that sort of a stress on you as a person to see both sides of that? Or you stepped back? No,
look, it's a challenge like anybody else. I'm certainly guilty of motivated reasoning. I'm guilty of bringing my biases into an analysis that skews the analysis, particularly under high-pressure political circumstances. But I'm open to having a conversation with anybody. Sometimes the other side or represent the other side are not all that eager to have a conversation with me, but I'm happy to have it. And in the case of someone like Ben Ginsberg, who, a longtime Republican Party lawyer, represented the Republican Senate Campaign Committee and the Republican National Committee, was the architect of their very successful and aggressive gerrymandering or redistricting strategy in the 1990s. He and I have always been on the opposite side of political disputes, but even today, we co-chair an organization that is designed to uphold the work of professional election administration and to defend election officials in their work. And we do that around the country as a Democrat and a Republican. That's a clear message that, notwithstanding our other differences, that is work that we can do together. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when we go on the road, we encourage a whole range of community leaders, including some who are absolutely going to vote for Donald Trump. I, as a Democrat, am not happy with that choice, but I'm happy to have them in the room to have that conversation and to agree with them where we can on what's necessary for the two parties to at least suspend hostilities long enough to respect the democratic process and to attempt where they can to strengthen it.
Right, sort of a commitment to the larger whole. I want to ask you about one area that you're famous or infamous, depending on the person, for, that is highly partisan, has been highly partisan, perhaps a little bit less so now in the last 10 years, and that's campaign finance regulation. Mm-hmm. You notice in that you devote a chapter in it to the book, and you note at the beginning of that chapter that the New York Times identified you as I think, the prime heretic in the Democratic Party about this topic, which I think is a revealing choice of words, because heresy is usually a religious topic, isn't it? Yeah. I do want to make clear here that talk about this in a sense, but Bob is not a libertarian on campaign finance regulation, but on the other hand, he's also, I would say, skeptical about much of it. And that created issues, right? Because I once observed, and you know, for better or worse, thought this was true, that campaign finance reform, that term, was very much in the DNA of Democrats who were really committed. And it certainly, and it was a large organization committed to it and so on. So what led you to go out on your own here? And then I have a theory about why you developed skepticism, but how did you manage to, again, rise to the top of the profession in a way and hold these views that weren't, and you might want to characterize your views because I don't want to impose them on you.
Sure. Well, first of all, of course, I'll note, John has written a really exceptional book on campaign finance. The Fallacy of Campaign Finance Reform, I think, is the title. Yeah. An excellent book with an awful lot of historical observation. I mention it both to honor the book, but also because it seems to me that it is a mistake not to absorb what you can learn from your own experience. And so as a lawyer, I absorbed how this regulatory scheme that developed post-Watergate was in the making before Watergate, as you point out in your book, but it was accelerated post-Watergate, how the campaign finance regulatory scheme actually operated. And number one, I didn't think it was working terribly well toward its professed goals. Number two, it was becoming so complicated that people like me could make a living charging folks for engaging in political activity, in some cases activity that on its face of it seems sorely benign. And you wouldn't expect the government to come knocking on your door asking you questions about what you did. One of my earliest experiences is a distraught candidate. This is many, many, many years ago, but it did have an effect on me. A distraught candidate who discovered that, contrary to her beliefs, her father was like any other donor and could not give unlimited sums to her fledgling congressional campaign, which had to be shut down because he was fundamentally financing it dramatically in excess of contribution limits. And she thought, well, but it's my dad, he's not corrupting me, he's my father. And that's a minor example of many other examples that I could give much more significant in scale about a regulatory regime that in many respects kind of winds up running up against common sense, being very expensive to people who have to navigate it, and just complicates the conduct of a lot of important political activity. I'm not opposed to all campaign finance regulation. I think there's a room for reasonably drawn contribution limits and for transparency requirements. But the more complicated it gets, and there's a dynamic that increases the likelihood of complication, the more I think it just completely exceeds the bounds of what it was intended or could reasonably or rightly be expected to do. And I'll just close by saying there's this concept in the law called circumvention. Justice Roberts referred to it, Chief Justice Roberts, as prophylaxis upon prophylaxis. The law is X, somebody violates it, so it has to be strengthened with X plus Y. Then somebody finds a way around X plus Y, so it becomes X plus Y plus Z. Then somebody figures out a clever way to get around that, it becomes X plus Y plus Z plus Q. It's just one layer of regulation on another to try to shore up the original failed prescription. That never ends, and it winds up being a very significant burden on First Amendment rights of speech and association.
But I think also, and it's hard to say the degree that this is true, but I think what you see then, at least in the old days, and maybe now too, you see in the media is talk of loopholes, talk of skullduggery, basically. And I think in which it's kind of incentive-based behavior, but it contributes to some of the distrust of the entire process, right? Because the term corruption, you have this sort of core term, which we were aware of, bribery and so on. And then, but it became much more expansive than that. All of these things you're talking about were referred to as, a lot of things were referred to as corruption. And so you got this sort of unexpected and unwanted consequence of delegitimizing the politics, delegitimizing campaigns to some extent.
Yeah, that's right. An expansive conception of corruption coupled with the further sort of expectation that this kind of activity wouldn't violate the appearance of corruption. So you have the actual corruption, and you have the appearance of corruption. And of course, any appearance standard, which is at the heart of a lot of ethics regulation, is very elastic and can be moved in a lot of different directions depending on the audience whose perception you're concerned with. And this, by the way, I should just add really quickly, I don't want to get ahead of this point, is where ethics comes in. A lot of appropriate behavior on the campaign trail and by office holders that involves campaign money, a lot of that behavior that we might be concerned with can't be reached by law, but depends on sound choices by people who are in positions of responsibility, how they raise their money, the kinds of commitments they make to donors. They can get away with a significant amount of shady conduct that is not illegal conduct. Whether they do or they don't depends on their ethical sensibilities, and we can talk about specific examples of that.
So and you can correct me here, of course, if I'm wrong, but I always assumed something you mentioned in passing in the book, which is that the successful politician learns to manage their donors in a way. That is, they actually don't become, hirelings or some way subservient to their donors, and it's very difficult to say who actually is in charge here, and often it's after all, many of these people are incumbents and are very likely to be elected. And so a comment that was made by a significant Republican contributor to presidential elections, his advisor said of him, so-and-so understands that he's going to give all this money to these politicians. They're going to do what they want to anyway, but there's no really option for him in trying to affect policy. It's not always the case, of course. This is human nature and human beings, but is that frequently the case in your experience, that politicians are actually the ones in charge of this process?
I think they have a wide range of choices that they can make and still be successful. Mm-hmm. It is not necessary for a politician in raising significant amounts of money, in my view, to operate at the borderline of what's acceptable, mm-hmm. To act in ways that we would condemn because it's an abuse of their office, abuse of their position, either as candidates or as elected officials. I've seen politicians raise an enormous amount of money and do very well and rise in politics who have had training of staff and office policies that keep them well away from anything that could be legitimately criticized as corrupt fundraising, corrupt practices with political money. Some of the politicians that I've seen who act the most notoriously corruptly, honestly, I don't think they represent the norm, certainly not in the United States Congress. And oftentimes it's because they're just really bad politicians. They don't practice their craft very well. They lose control of those relationships. If you lose control of those relationships, then you're not practicing effective politics and you're not going to be a successful office holder. Now, there are exceptions, mm-hmm. but I think that is pretty much what you encounter.
But it really helps to be President Obama, doesn't it, where your donors are falling all over one another to give you money because it's a high-status thing to do, and they want to be part of this moment of history, right? So I'm sure President Obama was good at raising money, but that's the sort of thing that makes it very easy. And presidents generally, or significant presidential candidates, often don't have trouble.
Yeah, I think that's right. I should mention when we talk about, for example, a case like Citizens United that was widely thought to open the door to large commercial companies basically buying up the political process, mm-hmm. and you compare it to what is most visible in quote-unquote big money today, we don't really talk much about large commercial companies intervening in campaigns. We talk about major donors, quote-unquote, being individuals who are ideologically or politically motivated. They may want to be in the game, or they may literally are so committed to their particular politics that they're looking to be influential and move their politics in a particular direction. Consider the number of those who are classified as major donors who by name stepped in and announced that they were not going to provide the Democratic Party with any additional funding unless President Biden withdrew from the race. Now, whether that was in any way sort of influential in the outcome or not is subject to debate, but that's an attempt to exercise tremendous control over the political process but not in an economically self-interested way.
That's correct, but it's also, it's not just I mean, in a sense, the primary process that we fell into, committed ourselves to 50 years ago when we were young. That process was justified as more democratic. We got away from the smoke-filled rooms and all of that, and to run around it was a serious thing, even though, I mean, the argument against it is the candidate that replaced him was, no one seemed to be against her, right? It was acclamation. But in that sense, the donors and their effects, which seemed to me to be one among many factors that was going on, was a really serious matter.
Well, it's an extraordinary, the reason I mentioned it is not because I'm not expressing a normative judgment one way or the other. I'm saying that is a case, whatever you think of that assertion of influence, that doesn't have to do, on the face of it, in most of the cases that I'm familiar with somebody looking to buy up policy. They just want to influence the outcome. You can still object to it strongly and say they shouldn't have that kind of outsized influence as quote-unquote major donors, but they certainly attempt to exercise it. They exercise it openly, and it's a very different character than the interests that people were concerned about after Citizens United was decided.
Yeah, I think it's been consistent, too. I remember when, about the time I met you, I noticed that in the initial soft money era, when you had large donations coming and outside the contribution limits, they were also published, who gave what, and almost all of those donations were given to one party or the other. Very few people or very few organizations were giving 50-50 to see, to hedge their bets against the. So you have the big money comes from ideological, and I think that's probably true also in the post-Citizens United era. So I think it's only fair, I know you have doubts about Citizens United, it's only fair to let you say, well, what are those, and how do you think do you see, since a chance for changing it, or should we want to change it, and what would be consistent with. By the way, I should also say, you're in a sense, I don't think I've ever met a election lawyer who had an interaction with the system that didn't become more of a Cato person, in the sense of more skeptical about, and for precisely the reason you say, they see some poor person that didn't know the rules, and they got pulled into the system. That's usually what happens, and the person's usually an outsider and probably not a major donor and so on. That's the story you often hear time and again. But please, it's always interesting to hear the other side about Citizens United.
First of all, I don't think, as you notice, there's continued to be a lot of rhetorically expressed and maybe emotionally expressed concern about Citizens United, to the extent that it expresses the view that corporations are like natural persons in the exercise of their First Amendment rights. That really bothers people, and I understand entirely why. And I don't think, by the way, that Justice Kennedy's opinion in that case is a masterpiece of judicial craftsmanship. Having said that, what's really significant at Citizens United is not the original fear that large companies would walk through that door and start spending huge amounts of money to buy up the political process. It opened the door to super PACs. Opened the door to, and then a subsequent decision called Speech Now enhanced the meaning and the significance of that decision, and that is that these political committees that operate in technical senses independent of candidates can take in whatever money they want and spend up as much as they want out of it. And so there are now major hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent by political committees that are fundamentally, with the exception of some transparency requirements, they're unregulated and they're branded by each party. There are super PACs that are recognized on the Republican side and super PACs that are recognized on the Democratic side that donors understand are the best place, the approved place for them to put their independent expenditure money. And here's what's happened. Neither political party is prepared to stand down from that. It becomes competitively necessary for them to operate in this extremely expensive, hard-fought campaign world operating under conditions of extreme polarization, they'll chase the money wherever they can find it because it's viewed as competitively necessary. And what I do with some of my Democratic audiences when we discuss money in politics and the role of super PACs and significantly inflating costs, or at least reflecting the increased costs of politics and what political actors judge to be the competitive requirements of raising enough money, I ask a simple question. I ask for a show of hands from Democrats like myself who are prepared to put a dollar limit at whatever level on how much money they could raise and spend to put an end to Donald Trump's political career. And I've yet to get a taker. 2 billion? Is it 3 billion? Is it 4 billion? Is it 10 billion?
Right.
Silence. Because there is, in a case where people view their political objectives as absolutely critical to be achieved, the argument about taking money out of politics doesn't have much purchase.
To renew a discussion that you and I have had for 15 or 20 years, haven't we really just gone full circle in which we've gotten rid of the parties but reestablished them as a fundraising vehicle in a certain way? We both are. I mean, legally, of course, they're not parties. But if you abstract from the legality, they look a lot like something parties would be doing. And as you say, they're even branded. So a lot of politics we think is good and evil, but sometimes I think we're just going toward a certain place, and how far around we're going to get to that place, right, is the question. Is that fair to say? And also I think you don't talk a lot about parties in the book, but I know that in the past you've thought that parties are pretty good ideas, but you were very pessimistic about bringing back strong parties that could, for example, prevent outsider candidates from becoming president of the United States, right? So what about that?
I don't know what the future holds. I mean, the political parties today are very different than they were, obviously, in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, late 19th century. We have a very different party system. And those who think we have strong parties typically manage to make their case by redefining what a party is. And then they wind up talking about the whole ecosystem around parties that includes, the super PACs and media organizations that are closely affiliated with parties or seem to echo the party line. And so they say we have robust parties, but they're not defining parties quite the same way as some would. So, for example, if you look at parties as potentially being robust because they have an extremely loyal membership, and the membership may have differences of opinions about some issues, but they nonetheless are willing to all aggregate under the same tent. They find that coalition workable for them. And so it's really membership driven, and that loyalty is profound. I think that kind of loyalty is thinning out. And I think we have sort of more a la carte politics. If the Democratic Party disappoints those who currently are affiliated with it and disappoints them in a major way, they'll look at alternatives. And then the party's going to have to try to get them back, which is typically what's happened in our party system. But I'll give you an example from my own family. I mean, I come from a family of Democrats who wouldn't consider voting for a Republican. They might even say that Republican is a really nice person, but I'm not voting for a Republican. I think that that kind of deep affiliation with the party as an institution is not something that we see as a significant feature of the party system today. It may look like it, but I don't think it's the same.
So I think that's right, and it's important to make the point here. What you're talking about, that kind of affiliation, is not the same thing as like apparently views held by about 20% of both parties that we'd be better off without the other party. It's a deep commitment to ideas. Or with Democrats, I often think it's a commitment to the underdog, to wanting to see people rise and so on. Those kinds of ideas. It's a set of kind of feelings mixed in with thoughts, right? But it's not an antagonistic necessarily feeling. For a long time, people would vote for Democrats no matter what, or Republicans no matter what. But it didn't have to go to the extent that you see now, in which it's very vindictive and people hate each other, really. So I wanted to, this book is a memoir, so, and we should talk a bit about that. To me, the most striking part of the book was the story of your father and his near, the way I would put it, near destruction in the McCarthyite machine of the 1950s. Tell us something about that. I think it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, my father came, he came at the age of 30, he had already been a lawyer in Austria. He fled Austria as a political opponent of regime the day the Germans marched in, and met my mother in flight in Czechoslovakia and came to the United States. And he wound up spending most of his life here in government service, in the foreign service most of the time. And he was a very strong Roosevelt Democrat and an ardent patriot and a strong believer that democratic institutions and norms really counted. I was very struck because he despised Richard Nixon. That the day that Nixon resigned, he was less joyful that Nixon was leaving and more moved that the democratic process had held together, that there was a transition of power, that Ford could get up in the East Room and say, we move on. And that all the institutions that had a hand in the resolution of the Watergate crisis, the courts, the Congress, right, that all of them performed their assigned roles, he thought, honorably and in defense of the democratic process and the constitutional system of government that we have. He always spoke to the end of his days with a strong accent. He came to the United States in 1940, and he got caught up in some respects in a peripheral way, but it became central to the family in the McCarthy period, because when McCarthy was looking for communists in various parts of the government, he didn't accuse my father of being a communist. He accused my father of being a communist dupe who had been in the Voice of America in charge of programming that was meant to be anti-communist programming, and that for various reasons, my father had not discharged his mission competently, and my father demanded to be heard. He demanded to be heard. He wanted to defend himself in a public hearing. The person who came to his defense, in granting him the request, who came to his defense at the hearing, was a hardcore Republican conservative from North Dakota by the name of Carl Mundt. And Mundt didn't think it was fair for my father to be accused without having a response, and Mundt didn't think the accusations against my father were fair. And in the hearing, he cut McCarthy off at some point and said, "Why are you doing this? He's got a completely fair account. He seems like a patriotic American to me." And McCarthy then backtracked and said, "No, I never said he wasn't," and so forth, which wasn't true. It made of course, that whole experience and my father's intense engagement with the politics of his adopted country had an enormous effect on my own thinking. When you say it's a memoir, it is a memoir because I draw a lot on my own experiences. I do try to avoid it, writing kind of an autobiography. It's not that. It's more thematically organized, but yes, there's a memoirish element to it, to be sure, and it was meant to be that way.
A question that occurs to me now that didn't occur to me while reading it. Do you think, I know perfectly well what you're talking about with your father, and particularly on the issue of patriotism. Do you think that's less prevalent in America now, that kind of patriotism, pride, and democracy?
I have to tell you, and I'll give you, I'm optimistic. We have a very ugly politics right now, for sure, in any number of ways. And I do worry actively about it. I don't minimize the threat. But I mentioned Ben Ginsberg earlier. We co-chair an organization called Pillars of the Community. It's the one that tries to defend election officials and their work and bring community leaders together with election officials to better understand and then be able to represent to their communities how the elections are being prepared for. And we start with closed-door meetings so that nobody has to look over their shoulder and wonder who's watching them in these dialogues. I've been in the room with people who will not vote for the candidate that I support, the ticket I support, the Harris-Walz ticket. They absolutely will vote for Donald Trump. They will dismiss a lot of the criticisms that people have of Trump's behavior and rhetoric and performance in office, what have you. But if you're in a room with the door closed and there's a conversation about, if you will, first principles, there's a foundation for genuine agreement about these democracy, honoring, promotion, preservation issues. It takes a while sometimes to get there because the initial response is sometimes a little guarded because they're in the room, Democrats are in the room with Republicans they strongly disagree with and vice versa. But I've been in Wisconsin, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, other states and that are contentious jurisdictions, and that's what I find. I think it's there. Whether we can tap it is a fundamental question about leadership, and particularly leadership in our communities, the people who run our businesses, the people who minister in our religious congregations, the people who run our higher educational institutions. That civil society leadership component, to me, is absolutely critical because it's not going to come from within the formal elected or competitive political process.
So in a sense, you rely on society to correct whatever.
To stand up, absolutely. To stand up, whichever way you voted, to realize there are limits to electoral competition that have to be observed if we're going to continue to compete within an accepted democratic system for policy promotion and candidate selection.
My license as a practicing intellectual requires me to say that's very Tocquevillian of you.
Of what?
It's very much like Alexis de Tocqueville's.
Yes, absolutely.
Democracy depending on society, really.
I think it's true. And what we find is they don't want to hear from the chair of the Democratic Party, the chair of the Republican Party, or the activists in the community. They want to hear from somebody they know who's been involved in the local chamber of commerce, who runs a chain of drugstores, or who taught their children. Who they respect elsewhere. And when those voices are heard, in defense of the process, drawing lines in what constitutes acceptable versus unacceptable behavior, they listen to that, and that's what we're trying to tap into.
I have a related question. I mean, one time you told me about some project you were working on for President Obama. And as part of that, you were trying to get business leaders who were favorable to him involved in this project. And you reported that there was a lot of trouble getting people to do that, right? Is it your sense that businesses, and we know, and mostly business people are talked about in terms of campaign finance or whatever, how that goes, or in terms of how the economy is performing. Is that a correct general statement, or at least of recent times, that business people probably aren't taking as much of a role? I know if you go back to when we're talking about your father again, the late New Deal, business people were at the very highest parts of that administration and in providing advice and insights, right? And law professors. Do you think, in a sense, business people, too, are playing less of a role in this and could play a better role in supporting getting out of this bad cycle?
Well, some do. I don't know that I have a sort of fulfilled vision. I don't know how I can generalize from across the business community as a whole. There are some constraints business leaders feel, sort of experience, and that is, it is not necessarily in their company's interest to get in the middle of what will be perceived to be political disputes. It'll make their customer base unhappy or their shareholders unhappy, and so, or at least some segment of their shareholders, and so they try to stay away from it. But there are others who do believe that if you run a hugely significant business in our economy, then there are not necessarily policy disputes that you want to enter into, but some fundamental civic spirited engagements that are appropriate. And a good example would be, you would expect the business community to line up behind the elemental proposition that we don't resolve our disputes through violence in this country, right? There shouldn't be any reason why that should upset their shareholders or their client base. That's what they absolutely should do if they have that kind of a position. And I do think people who are in leadership positions at the national level or at the state and local community level have a degree of influence and power that shouldn't be underestimated, and they have some responsibilities to go with it.
So let's return to your father again and his departure from Europe. A lot of people some people, after, particularly in Germany, after World War II, looked back in the decade or so afterwards and said, in a sense, the problem of Hitler and the problem of the destruction of democracy, liberalism in Austria and Germany and other countries was that it was too respectful of these people who were absolutely intent on destroying liberal democracy or democracy, were allowed to run amok because their rights were protected, right? The sort of view that the rights of freedom of speech, rights of association, all those things. And from this grows the idea of militant democracy, which was a German idea. The idea being that in certain circumstances, certain times, you have to, as it were, suspend rights of political association or political engagement or however you define it in order to defend democracy itself. Now, Bob is the only person I've noticed, and I've noticed this trend in modern political discussions. Bob is the other person that has noticed it. And you mentioned it in passing, that people are talking more about militant democracy means than in the past, and yet you don't think it's a warranted path to go down. So why is that? And what sort of things do you think people are talking about?
In its most extreme form, as you said, it's almost like calling a state of emergency in which normal constitutional guarantees are suspended or normal norms that are typically honored are cast aside for the time being. And that's dangerous. I mean, it's very difficult to come back from that. And as we see even now, those who are very much opposed to Donald Trump and what he stands for, and I count myself among that number for sure, think he represents a threat to the democratic process, or much of what he says, policy programs or actions that he espouses that he would take if he became president again, justifications that he provided of what he's done in the past, I view her as inconsistent with expectations we would have of a political leader, inconsistent with norms that we would expect a leader to honor. But you hear on the other side the claim that, in fact, the threat to democracy is coming from the Democratic Party. And they will point to lawfare, weaponization of law, the prosecutions of Donald Trump, both the federal and the state level. And so each side could declare its own emergency and then decide to suspend rights, whether with the best of intentions but wrong-headedly, or the worst of intentions and with cynical design. And so we have to be very careful about that in its form of militant democracy in that most sort of strongly stated sense. Now, does that mean, for example, that there aren't protections that we shouldn't enact? For example, I'll just take one that I think people have discussed, and it's been addressed in various ways, violence directed against officials, like election officials, not just the President of the United States or the Vice President of the United States or members of Congress, but people who manage the electoral process, who are threatened, directly threatened, in an attempt either to drive them from their posts or to influence them in the conduct of their duties. And if there needs to be some strengthening of the laws to stop that kind of thing, then I think, depending on how those laws are written, I could only favor that. But we have to be careful about things like invasions of fundamental free speech regimes and that sort of thing. We're really, really careful about the circumstances which declare that to be within bounds.
I want to end on a couple of positive points. I mean, first of all, at various points in the book, you get a sense that you say something like, well, we're going through a cycle right now. And that's a problematic, some problem exists, which implies that, cycles don't always go down. That's a trend, right? So it implies that you think we're going to come out of this. What is it you see? I mean, it's right to have that kind of faith, I think. But what is it how do you see us coming out of this? If it's beyond our lifetime, maybe.
Well, I don't know that I say expressly I think we're going to come out of it in the sense that, I have a clear idea that one day we'll wake up and more of what we expect from this political process will be given to us and less of what we object to it right now will have to experience. I think we're going to come out of it very different than we were when we went into it. I think we're going through a period of turbulent political change, and I don't think there's any reversion to some state of affairs beforehand. I don't think it's going to be the same. I don't think political parties are going to be the same. There's a lot, it seems to me, that will potentially be affected by what we've passed through over a number of decades, and that includes the period before Donald Trump. But I do think you can't relinquish your faith or your confidence or your commitment. And I do also believe, as I said earlier, that continued efforts at bipartisan dialogue are critical. And let me just, because I know we're getting to the end of this phase, let me just mention one thing that doesn't have to do with campaign finance reform or election-related reform like protection of election officials, but something else I've written about and that you're very familiar with, and that is the institution of the presidency. I have long viewed, and I've written a book with Jack Goldsmith on this topic, that what we have seen over a long period of time is an over-empowered presidency that paves the way for the demagogic president prepared to bust norms, prepared to challenge legal safeguards, or to declare them non-applicable. And I think it's a really dangerous part of our democracy, and for too long, both political parties have been, and by the way, some of this is rooted in political cultural expectations of the presidency, beautifully described by Gene Healy of this institute in his book, The Cult of the Presidency, which has just been reissued. It was published a number of years ago and again this year. So there's a political cultural element here of what people expect from their president. But there's also two political parties that too often, because once the prize is there, they want to make full use of it, are prepared to abide presidencies that operate without regard to what I think are essential guardrails on limits on presidential power. And I think that is something, if we're going to really come out of this dangerous period, that also ought to get more attention than it has.
So I want to end on a slightly non-political point. I've reached that point of old age or older, being a mature individual, in which I take some joy in giving avuncular advice to young people. So I'm going to invite you into this process too, which you may have reached this point also. So for the young people listening or you come across, I want to tell a story about Bob that I think is very revealing, which is I remember talking to Bob probably 10 or 15 years ago. He was at the time general counsel to President Obama. And he had left the White House and gone over to the Department of Justice. I don't know if you remember this or not. He'd gone over to the Department of Justice for some kind of meeting, and he showed up, and they wouldn't let him in. He didn't have conclusive proof. He'd forgotten his proof or something like that. So the general counsel of the president ended up driving the car back out, or who was with him drove the car back out and had to park on the street. Now, this guy was a big deal, right? The standard thing a big deal person in D.C. does in a situation like that is get really upset and have somebody's head, right? The guy who kept him out didn't recognize who he was. That's the standard way. Our friend here responded with a fair amount of bemusement about the whole thing, and as if, I've been taken down a peg. Isn't that funny? And then and then followed up with a rumination about how chance had affected his life, particularly how he became general counsel to the president, how it could have gone another way, and all of this sort of thing. So for those out there, young people who might one day be a big deal in D.C., how does one achieve that? How does we keep some kind of sense of balance and a sense of self, the limits of your own ego and yourself?
Well, my day job now is, I talk to students a lot because my full-time day job is teaching law at NYU. I still practice some on the side, and I'm involved in the activities I just mentioned, including, by the way, also voting rights work on the Democratic side of the aisle. But I teach, and students will say, well, how do I get myself into a position where I can advance in politics and whatever? And what I say this over and over again just because it starts the conversation on the right foot. oftentimes the fact that I was White House counsel to Obama is one of the first things I get asked about. And I say completely truthfully, this isn't false humility, it's absolutely true. I tell them, if you are of the opinion that Barack Obama chose me off of a list he was provided of the 10 best lawyers in the United States, you would be grossly mistaken. That is not why I became White House counsel. I became White House counsel because I was involved in the political process. I came to represent President Obama when he was a senator. And over time, because I worked with him in the Senate, not as a Senate staffer, but as an outside lawyer, as I worked for him as a candidate, as general counsel, as presidential campaigns, I built a relationship with him. That's it. I mean, I'd like to think he thought I was competent. I didn't understand him to be appointing people he didn't think were competent, even if they had served him well in the past. But what I say to them is, look, the old phrase, you make your own luck, is to some extent true. But if you get involved in politics at any level, and I try to direct a lot of people outside of Washington, D.C., and say, don't forget state and local communities where people can play an enormous role in the politics of the country, and a constructive one, and not have to do so in the shadow of the Capitol, right? You meet people, you establish yourself, you perform well, you gain trust, and lightning may strike, and you'll move to the next thing that you care about, or even something else you didn't think of that actually turns out to be a very good turn in your career. But there is no, it's impossible to discount the role of good fortune.
Well, and that might lead you to keep a sense of limitation, which is hard here, right? I mean, this is the most important, most powerful place on earth, in a sense.
And it is important occasionally to do little things. I've talked about this a little bit with my students. Do little things just to remind you that, you get invited, like, news organizations chase you around when you're White House counsel or chief of staff or you're head of the domestic policy committee. They chase you around for nice tickets to things like the White House Correspondents' Dinner or the Gridiron. And my wife has a phrase, which I love, which is, they're not inviting you, they're inviting your job. And as soon as it's not your job, they're not going to be inviting you anymore. And that's always a good thing to think about. And the other thing is, I know people who, populate their offices with pictures of them shaking hands with important people. And I tried to avoid that because I wanted to remind myself that, these things pass. Somebody else takes your place. And the fact that you know important people doesn't make you important.
On that point, we'll end, and the avuncular part will go to the questions. We're going to have questions here inside in a minute, but first of all, I want to tell our online audience, which has already started to ask questions, you can join the conversation, submit questions directly on the event webpage, on Facebook, YouTube, and on X using hashtag Cato Events, where both the C and the events E are capitalized. So who would like to ask our first question here? I would ask that you speak directly into the microphone so everyone in the auditorium and online can hear, and once you raise your hand, the microphone will come to you. Down here in front, please.
You refer to corruption in your speeches. The issue, for me at least, is that while U.S. government officials, corporations, Israel, and those that are the main supporters and the main creators of corruption all over the world, not only, and they get the benefits back here. Why are you surprised, or that, for example, IPAC or somebody else, or super PACs, they control through the funding election or non-election or funding some of the candidates? And what's the way to prevent it?
So just to make sure I understand your question, it's preventing super PACs from controlling the candidates because they fund them? I just want to make sure I understood your question.
I mean, that's what I'm telling, that while corruption is acceptable for government, for the U.S. policy, even Congress for in other parts of the world, why is not, you think it's not acceptable? Of course, it's being used over here, but why or how to prevent it that super fund or an organization like IPAC, Israeli Political Action Committee, to force or to fund a candidate and force them out of the way and elect somebody who's going to do what they want.
Well, again, I'm not sure, and I don't think the political science demonstrates that campaign contributions or campaign spending is one of the primary drivers of the way elected officials in the United States behave. Not most of them, which is to say, it's not unimportant to them where they get their money or who is supported to them, but there are a range of other things that they think about, that they care about, that helps define their success as candidates, other than just campaign money. And so a lot of donors of the more corrupt brand who think they're buying politicians by giving them money don't understand the sort of complexity of calculation on the part of people who hold office and want to retain it. The second thing I would just mention is that some of these super PACs that you're talking about, they're party branded. They're controlled by party interests. They're not actually controlled by commercial interests. And so they're actually spending money to elect candidates affiliated with their own party. They're not instruments just for the translation of private interests into the political process. They're not run by major businesses. They may take large. There's some different. How would I call it? There's some exceptions. Some people will mention, for example, the Koch brothers have had, spent a lot of money in American politics, but even there, without getting into the differences, not all of which I can remember about the brothers and how they approach these things, there's also a powerful ideological element there too. So again, I don't think that you can be worried about, I don't want to dismiss the significance of money in politics altogether, not at all. But I also think we have to be realistic about what we can change by just legal command and what we can accomplish, I think, more reasonably with transparency requirements and carefully calibrated regulations that don't have the effect of suffocating normal, appropriate political activity and violating fundamentally, unintentionally, First Amendment speech and association rights.
I probably should mention at this point that the aforementioned Koch brothers were two of the founders of the Cato Institute, which I think actually supports Bob's point, which is the Cato Institute is an institution with a certain moral and philosophic outlook that tries to affect politics, but has always been very wary of being involved in politics and probably not as, the people drawn to it are not particularly talented in that area and in the sense of being, but I want to turn to another issue here from an online question that I think maybe we were talking about a week ago, and this may also be a slight departure from what some of your fellow partisans believe, which is you're asked about your views on the presidential immunity decision and the dissents that go with it.
For a number of reasons, I'm critical of the craftsmanship of the opinion, and I think that its long-term effects are, at the moment, somewhat unknowable, because without a doubt, one of the intended effects of the opinion was to leave to future decision-making down the line, in particular cases, in the practical effects of the doctrine that's articulated in that case. So there's much that we don't know about how that's ultimately going to shake out. There is no question, however, that the court was dealing with a real immunity issue. After all, for years, just set aside for a moment the whole Donald Trump situation, and the court's quick to say we can't get involved with the Trump situation. We're deciding this case for years to come. But for years, executive branch law has been that presidents enjoy full immunity from prosecution, not investigation, from prosecution for the period of time they're in office. There's already this significant zone of immunity that the executive branch, representing the executive branch over time through Democratic and Republican administrations, there's a position on immunity that's already been carved out for that office-holding period. And it was inevitable that a question like this was going to come up. And in many respects, I mean, the fact that it got forced into this extraordinarily difficult situation and troubling situation with Donald Trump means that how we discuss this immunity question has just been shadowed by Trump and shadowed by the ongoing prosecutions. Mm-hmm. But I urge anybody, I don't always listen to the opinions or the cases that I'm interested in, but I did listen to the argument in Trump versus United States. And it's an extraordinary argument. The questions are very thoughtfully posed. The counsel for the United States government, Michael Dreeben, is a longtime advocate, for the United States government, longtime government lawyer who was, extremely thoughtful and careful in his responses. And to understand Trump versus United States, I think listening to the argument and reading the transcript is in many respects a good way to start before you get to the opinion itself, because the opinion itself does have problems. But the fundamental question of how do we think about immunity for the chief executive, that's a complicated question.
I have a question in the back here, so I'll go back and forth between the online.
You mentioned the importance of Citizens United. You didn't talk very much about your own views. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own views on the political rights of non-natural persons, which can include corporations, associations, goodness knows what, but non-natural persons. What political and campaign contribution rights do they have? And since we're in 2024, I might as well also ask, do you envision it ever possible that electronic persons might have political rights as well as corporate persons? And the electronic person being obviously artificial intelligence that has its own identity and wants to speak about politics or its positions or its candidates or whatever. So non-natural persons, what rights do you think they should have? And could this ever extend to such things as electronic persons? Thank you.
Well, that last question, I have to be honest, is one I've never thought about. It's hard for me to think about the creation of electronic people without thinking about the design of the person who created them. So who's in charge of the programming there leaves a whole set of questions that I'm not competent to answer. On the question of corporations, listen, corporations still can't constitutionally make contributions directly to candidates. They can spend independently because their speech has been treated, their independent speech has been treated as something beyond regulation, by extension of other constitutional principles. So I think there's already an acceptance. They don't have the rights that every other natural person has. They can't give directly to candidates. And here is where I guess I have to fall back on sort of a fundamental question of what is acceptable in a political culture. I think that the ban on direct corporate giving to candidates is one that we ought to find every reason to sustain over time, because I think that the prospect of Amazon giving contributions directly to a candidate, Mobil Oil giving contributions directly to a candidate, it also raises again the specter of foreign national controls, because what do you do with domestic USA corporations that are either majority or wholly owned by a foreign company? And I just think that the strain that this places on public acceptance are just vastly greater than the significance of any rights that we might think we're protecting here. So I do think that there is a carve-out from the same rights that all other citizens have for certain non-natural citizens. I think there is a carve-out, there is an exception that we make, rights that we do not grant in full measure to those non-natural citizens, and necessary to uphold basic public intuitions about what's fair and just in political competition. And that's the best answer I can give you. The electronic person, I'm going to be worrying about that for the rest of the day.
So let's jump forward to your current job. And I know you've thought about this question some. One of the questions online is, how many conservatives at your law school?
How many conservatives, pardon me?
At your law school, at NYU Law. So so implicit in that, I'm going to interpret this question, is that it's pretty clear that if you look at the major law schools, and by some measures NYU is the top law school in the country, that they are overwhelmingly, if we were drawing a distribution of them, they would lean left pretty strongly, I would say. Is there a problem with that? Certainly there's not. We don't want the government fixing that. I think we can agree with that. But do you see a problem with that, or do you see that that's, I have a friend, for example, a guy we both know, and anytime this comes up, he always says, well, I think there'll be, J.D. Vance didn't go to a marginal state school. He went to Yale. Mm-hmm. That there's always going to be leadership coming out of these that are conservative leadership. And so you shouldn't worry so much about the distribution of the faculty. What do you think about that?
But distribution among the faculty or among the students?
Well, among the faculty, I think.
Oh, among the faculty.
Yeah. Also students, too.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe more.
NYU law, clearly, I suspect the person asking the question is skeptical that there's an ideological balance either on the faculty or among the students. It's in New York, it's NYU law. But I can tell you, it's one of the reasons I went there, and I'll cite something in particular, the faculty workshop culture. There is I think, wide range of interest in diverse and competing points of view. I've never sat down and tried to figure out, how many Democrats versus how many Republicans, and who might be a Democrat who's not saying so, who might be a Republican who's not saying so. But I certainly have not seen in conversations at NYU sort of a, if you will, canceling out of conservative points of view. There are conservative members of the faculty, and they identify as such. There's some others who are quite distinctly not conservative who identify as such. What matters to me most is what sort of diversity of viewpoint, willingness to engage with diverse viewpoints is promoted within the culture of that particular institution. If it's a culture that basically cancels out a certain point of view, not interested in that diverse discussion, that, it seems to me, is a major institutional problem. And that's a problem regardless of what the numbers tell you about the balance of conservative and liberal perspectives. And I'd have to say, at NYU, I've had conversations, wide-ranging conversations on a whole host of topics where I just didn't detect a certain shunning of particular points of view and a validation of only one line of argument on a controversial issue. I just haven't had that experience, and it's one of the reasons I've been quite happy there.
Yeah, I in my other job with Meta, I have association with one of your colleagues who also, and this may be part of the story too, is familiar with working with businesses on issues kind of like diversity issues. And I found him to be a real ally and extremely helpful on these kinds of issues about what really becomes sort of inclusion issues for conservatives, right? So I think it's a good response. So we have a question here inside. Gentleman down front here, please.
Mark Lerner, when you talk about norms disappearing in politics, with the situation with the Supreme Court and Justice Thomas accepting gifts, Does that call for a strict code of ethics for the Supreme Court? And what would happen if they violate the code?
And what was happening, what, pardon me?
If they violated the code?
And could I just piggyback on that? Are wider changes in the court necessary? As you, I know you've been involved with that
Court
working
reform
group.
issues,
Yeah.
yes. Well, so it would be surprising if the Supreme Court were not currently swept up in the polarization that's affecting all our other institutions. And so the loss of its lower comparative poll rankings, vis-a-vis the Congress, vis-a-vis the presidency, not that it's lower than those, but the fact that its own public ratings have dropped in recent years doesn't especially surprise me, because it would be surprising to me, in fact, on the contrary, if they've been able to hold themselves out against this corrosion of trust in institutions that I think accompanies the kind of politics that we're experiencing in the United States right now. In that context, the criticisms of Justice Thomas don't help, obviously. And in that context, the Supreme Court's, I would call it, very conservative, if not grudging response to calls on it to adopt an ethics code, I don't think helped. I think the voluntary code that they put out is a step in the right direction, although I could have lived without a little bit of the preamble, which says, we're doing this because you never understood how we operated, and so we're now explaining to you how we operated, which is maybe a little bit more, I'm sure, unintentionally patronizing than it needed to be in response to legitimate concerns about how the court polices its own ethics. I am not, two things I'll say real quickly and then I'll stop. One is, I write in the book that some of the more extreme measures that people have been proposing, more aggressive, I won't call them extreme, aggressive measures people are proposing, court packing by those who are critical of it, court expansion by those who favor it, adding justice to the Supreme Court is not a measure that I support. I do support term limits, and I have for a long, long time. Long before the current period, I wrote my first piece on Supreme Court term limits in 2005. And I think there's a strong, strong case for term limits completely separate and apart from the current composition of the court or the character of its jurisprudence. And the delicate, the balance here, and the court has some responsibility for this, to be sure, how it, how it frames their disagreements, how they manage things like the inquiry into the leak of the Dobbs draft. The delicate trick here is to do everything we can to promote public confidence in the court, without going overboard in such a way that it both impairs the court's ability to function as an independent judiciary, and I'm going to put independent in quotes because it's independent in some respects and obviously not independent in others. I mean, it's dependent on the Congress, for example, for appropriations. It could, in fact, have its numbers augmented by congressional statute, so it's not 100% free-floating independent, but there's an independence of operation in the actual taking of cases and deciding of cases that we want to preserve. And we don't want to undermine that, and we don't want to further corrode public confidence unnecessarily. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about reforms in a serious way. And I'll just give one example. When I wrote my piece about term limits, Justice O'Connor, some months later, delivered an address to a law school, and not by name but by citation to the article and a few others, suggested that the discussion of court term limits was a threat to the court's independence, and that can't be right. That just cannot be right. We have to be able to talk about the court seriously, but that doesn't mean we should talk about the court irresponsibly.
So I'd like to piggyback another question on that, which not so much these days, but in the not too distant past, one solution thought to improve the court that doesn't have to, it's not a reform, it's just a different choice being made by presidents, which is that we've ended up with a bunch of people, capable people on the court from high prestige law schools who are quite academic in nature and quite attended to law school debates. Would we be better off if we had more people with political background, as was once often very much the case? And indeed, some of those people today are, recalled as very influential, important justices. Would it, in the turn away from any kind of political experience, is a sort of a turn toward a kind of independence and above it all? But hasn't that been a problem too?
I certainly absolutely think that potential nominees for the court who are not currently on the courts of appeals anywhere in the United States, I think they ought to absolutely be considered. I think diversity of background and experience and that kind of judgment that I think you're talking about, judgment that is acquired in the political process, could be very, very helpful to the court. I don't disagree with that at all. I think there's no reason to think that only appellate court, federal appellate court judges can serve on the Supreme Court of the United States and be considered qualified. And just if I mention, if that meant that we could move to earlier eras in Supreme Court practice and see shorter, more accessible opinions with a fraction of the textual footnotes that we're currently confronted with, I'd be all in favor of it.
Well, as long as it spreads to law review articles too. which
Yeah, well,
I
for
constantly
100,
complain about.
couldn't agree more.
As an outsider coming into that is, but so one last point, and I think our discussion suggests that whatever else, he deserves to be accurately characterized. One of our online participants has said that, sent in a correction, that Carl Mundt was actually from South Dakota. Now, whether that's true or not, we can settle with.
I think that was my mistake and not my father's.
Certainly Carl Mundt.
Whether he was north or south, he behaved well in those circumstances, but I appreciate
Yeah.
the correction. I have a feeling it may be incorrect in the book, and now my joy in not having anybody fact check me on the book has been shattered because I didn't get the difference between North and South Dakota. I'll check.
That's what happens when you go out in public with your ideas.
Terrible.
Well, it does sound like, Carl Mundt deserves to be remembered, particularly if he was doing this sort of thing across the board. I mean, that actually, for a conservative even, because I don't know if it was at the height of McCarthyism, that was a risky thing to do. He could turn on you.
He was so, I don't remember Carl Mundt's voting record, but he was really a hardcore conservative and probably said all sorts of things in support of the McCarthy mission that I would be horrified by. But in that particular case, with that particular individual, that critique in those circumstances, he thought, this isn't right. And that's what we need. We need people to step up at some point, separating themselves out from partisan outcomes and saying, this isn't right.
And that's the one lesson to take from this book. An individual acting ethically can make a difference.
Yes, and I think, by the way, we haven't talked about some recent examples, but there's some recent examples of people who are on the hot seat or reports about people who in the last administration were in the hot seat. And what they did, their individual choices that they made were extraordinarily and have been extraordinarily impactful.
So thanks to everyone for coming today, both online and the one crime against an author is not to show the book. So thanks for coming to the book forum. The book is The Unraveling, Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis by our guest, Bob Bauer. Please join us upstairs for lunch now. Thanks, Bob.